Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Michael, and thanks, Anna, for that very clear, very simple overview. Well, I'm going to drill down into a couple of the more specific components of international climate negotiations. Before I do that, I'm just going to spend the first minute talking about why OxFam is so concerned about climate change as a aid and development organisation, and why we're investing so much in trying to attain a fair and ambitious global deal in 2015. We heard yesterday morning, I think, from Professor Colin Butler about how climate change is a multiplier of security risks and geopolitical instability. Climate change is also a multiplier of poverty and of further entrenching existing injustices. And it's one of the tragic realities of climate change that those with the least responsibility for the problem tend to really bear the brunt. And as we just heard from Michael about the toll from floods in northern India just overnight, that's a very painful reminder of that fact. But I think perhaps the impacts of climate change are most savage in terms of the food system. And as I'm saying here, a hot world is a hungry world. The slow onset changes in temperature and rainfall, then compounded by extreme weather events that we heard a bit about from the Climate Commission yesterday, place immense strain on food production. And in parts of the world where there is already difficulty attaining enough to eat, that just makes that problem that much harder. I just pulled a couple of maps from a brand new World Bank report, an update of their Turn Down the Heat report that looks specifically at the challenges of climate change for development. This is just showing the number of extreme hot months, or the number of extreme temperature anomalies that you'd expect in a 2-degree world. Now obviously you can see it all over the planet, but it's more pronounced, particularly there in Middle Africa and other regions that already face a lot of food stress. And then if we look at the picture for a 4-degree world, of course, it's that much worse. And I think, as was also pointed out yesterday morning, we cannot adapt to 4 degrees of warming, not in a global sense. I mean, perhaps some regions and some portions of the population can, but there's simply no way, when you look at that amount of stress on food production, that the majority of the world would be able to cope. It's way beyond our sort of window of adaptation. I think that's something we need to keep reminding ourselves. Okay, so climate change is the mother of all development challenges, is the long and the short of it. So I'm now going to look at 2 specific aspects of the international climate negotiation process, that both of which I think Anna's flagged already. Should mention, by the way, I was talking there particularly about food production, but all of us will be aware of the acute challenges very close to home in the Pacific, where, of course, you have real existential risks from rising sea levels and seawater inundation and so forth. Anyway, having paused on those photos, I'll get back to where I was. Climate finance. So this then is the financial flows from developing countries to both aid with adaptation needs and also to unlock mitigation potential by supporting low-carbon development. It's obviously very significant from OxFam's particular perspective on the challenge. And the starting point for any conversation on climate change is the $100 billion a year by 2020 commitment that was first made in Copenhagen and then firmed up the next year in Cancun. Now, Australia, to its credit, did reasonably well during the first 3 years of that, a period known as Fast Start Finance. We put in a pretty decent share of the global goal and were fairly smart in how that was dispersed, making sure we prioritised some of the least developed regions and supported adaptation as well as low-carbon development. But we're now at a stage where we've got no new commitments. Sorry, I shouldn't say no new commitments. There are a handful from a few European countries, but no significant amounts of money on the table beyond that Fast Start period, which is leaving an enormous gap in global climate finance. And this is one critical component of reaching a 2015 deal, that unless we can increase those finance flows, there just won't be the confidence among developing countries that their needs will be met, and hence the goodwill and ambition needed to achieve a comprehensive deal. Financing is likely to remain at about the same level as it has for the last 3 years. At least that's what we're hearing from the government here. So we've got something to work with, but there's no strategy yet to scale it up to the levels that not only have been committed, but that are clearly very much necessary. And that 100 billion is not based on any needs assessments, and the true needs in terms of adaptation and mitigation funding are higher and getting much higher all the time. I won't dwell on this one because there's a little bit more I want to get through, but a shift towards the private sector, as you probably expect in this day and age, is very prominent, and while no one would deny the private sector has a big role to play in solving the climate crisis, when it comes to vulnerable communities which are unlikely to attract private sector investment, still need that reliable flow of public funds to make sure particularly those adaptation needs are properly met. Okay, so the next bit I'm going to look at is a little bit more cause for optimism perhaps, but I think just to be clear, and as Anna's also made clear, the financing is one particularly challenging part, I think, as we head towards 2015, in an area where we need to see a lot more commitment from developed country parties. Okay, so equity and effort sharing. So here we're talking about how countries determine their fair share of the global effort. If we look at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, like a lot of these foundational documents, they actually got quite a lot of it right, but it's how do you actually implement and stay true to those principles that are built in there. It's already established that countries need to act in accordance with their responsibility, which is usually understood as the amount of historical emissions they produced, and their capability, which is usually the available economic capability above a certain development threshold. Well, those principles are so vague that it's too open to misinterpretation, and a lot of countries will either ignore them or interpret them as ways that see fit. Now, one of the most encouraging developments in the last round of climate talks, and I was lucky enough to be in Bonn the last couple of weeks, was a proposal supported by a number of country parties to have an equity reference framework, or a negotiated framework within which pledges from different countries can be more objectively compared and reviewed and ratcheted up. Now, if we have some kind of process like that, then when we get to the pointy end of negotiations next year, and when we have countries to come forward with their pledges, it's going to be very, very hard. Well, it's going to be impossible for Australia, for example, to defend a 5% by 2020 pledge. I mean, I think most of us would see it as indefensible already, but if we're able to have a more robust discussion around effort sharing in the context of a negotiated framework, then that's going to really require developed countries to lift their level of ambition. And I just thought I'd give one illustrative example. Mexico is not a country I'd paid much attention to until very recently, I'm ashamed to say, but just to compare Mexico, which is a developing country, it's not required at the moment to make substantial emission reductions, but to compare them to ourselves, well, these two bars, first of all, give a sense of the relative historical responsibility for emissions from these two countries. And then if we look at their respective emissions reduction pledges, both have put in a target for 2050, which is good. And then if we look at what that actually translates to, so there the blue is Australia, the red is Mexico. As ambitious as our 80% by 2050 goal may seem, fulfilling that policy would still see us emitting twice as much per person in 2050 as the average person in Mexico. So I think we can't take even that target as a given. We've got to subject that to a effort sharing consideration as well, and the long and the short is that Australia really has to lift up its game both in the short term and the long term. So just some closing thoughts then, before hopefully we have time for a couple of questions. The first one is just to say that domestic and international campaigning are very much linked, and my sense is perhaps recently we've had a lot of really good energy and focus on getting stuff done here, particularly in terms of our coal export campaigning, which has been absolutely tremendous. We've maybe not been so good of late linking that into the international process, and perhaps the onus of those is on those of us who are very much involved in those international campaigns to make them a lot more simple and to be able to better connect the dots to what we do back here. But to give just one obvious example, when we have, hopefully, a 2015 deal consistent with that 2-degree goal, with binding commitments on all countries, that will actually give legal force to the call for us to leave 80% of fossil fuels in the ground. That will then be a legal imperative that we do that, and there will be no way getting around it. And just my other closing thought is to just encourage all of us to make sure we keep these international dimensions as part of our bigger story on climate change, and whether that's talking about impacts on the region, particularly in the Pacific, whether that's highlighting our existing obligations under the UNFCCC, particularly those financing obligations, or whether that's talking about how Australia's actions can either help or hinder progress to the 2015 deal. We've seen in the recent past just how damaging Australia can be in that forum. We don't want to see that again, and we want to be very clear how much it's in our national interest as well as an international imperative. So, I think I'm over time. I'd better wrap up. I'm just going to put up on the screen a plug for an event tomorrow for anyone interested in exploring climate challenges and solutions in the Pacific region. So, thanks very much.
Thank you, Simon.